Whether it's on purpose or not, many makers tend to hoard materials, placing that cutoff on the shelf while saying, "I'll use this for something, someday." As it collects dust and cobwebs, its potential stays in the back of your mind, and ideas start to gather on how it can be turned into something truly unique. This piece of walnut started off just like that. I can't remember which project this scrap came from because I've held on to it for so long. But I mainly kept it because I know there's a project in there that will highlight this knot with the attention it truly deserves. After cleaning out the loose material in the knot and resawing it on the table saw, I finished off the cut by hand. Running these boards through the planer will clean up the surfaces and bring them down to their final thickness. I decided to use the CNC to cut the overall shape, the dados for the side pieces, and the track for the tambour door. I started out with the top piece and it was going great until the bit tried to cut through the knottier section. I slowed the feed rate down for the bottom piece and it cut perfectly. Luckily, the top piece is still salvageable. I'm placing strips of wood into the grooves cut by the CNC and adhering the parts together. The strips are acting as registration pins, so the grooves stay aligned with each other while I cut out the exterior shape. I'm cutting off most of the excess material with the bandsaw and using a flush trim bit on the router table to match the shapes perfectly. Peeling these pieces apart is a bit tricky. I'm using a chisel and a shim just to get the process started, and I'm doing my best not to damage these pieces. But I didn't take into consideration how thin these walls are, and a small piece chipped off. But that gave me enough space to get in between the parts and separate them. The piece was still holding on with a couple fibers, but to repair it, it's actually easier to remove it completely and glue it back in place. I'm using brown CA glue to better hide the mistake. With a bit of sanding after the glue dries, it's almost like it never happened. I considered using a roundover to soften these edges, but I decided to go with a chamfer, just to break up all the round features that are in this box. The last thing to do to these parts is fill some small cracks, and instead of using the brown CA glue here, I'm using black. I think it looks a lot better and gives a subtle accent to these areas. With the top and bottom pieces done, I'm moving on to the tambour door. I have this piece of walnut that has a lot of sapwood and coloring to it that I think will be perfect. I cut a rabbet along both edges, and the tongue that's left over is what will ride in the track of the top and bottom pieces. I set up a stop block on my crosscut sled and started cutting all the slats. It's really important to keep all of these pieces in order so that the grain matches up later. With all the slats cut, I taped them together to better transport them without getting them mixed up. Off camera, I cut this additional piece that's exactly the same as the other slats, except the grain is running the length of the piece. This will be the first piece of the door and where the handle is attached to. The grain running in this direction makes it much stronger. To hold all the pieces tightly together and keep the edges aligned, I made this jig out of a couple pieces of plywood. Tambour works by adhering a flexible and durable material to the back of these pieces. In this case, I'm using a piece of canvas drop cloth. You can also use denim, and I think I've seen leather being used as well. I cut this to the right size and cut off the hemmed edge so that doesn't get in the way. If you want to try making tambour, an important thing to keep in mind is to not put fabric over the areas that will ride in the track. This will help the door slide smoother. Regular wood glue works great here, and after the glue dries for a bit, but isn't fully set, it's a good idea to remove the door from the jig and make sure the slats haven't glued themselves to each other. The side pieces are up next. These will fit in the dados of the top and bottom pieces, so I'm cutting a tenon on the ends of this board. I cut a tenon on both ends so that I can work on both side pieces at the same time and get them from the same piece. I would usually cross-cut small pieces like this using the crosscut sled on the table saw, but with the blade height dialed in to cut these tenons, I didn't want to change that to cut all the way through this piece, so I decided to use the miter saw to cut them to length. Then I repeated the process to cut the tenons on the opposite ends of these pieces. Taking multiple small passes on both faces of the board and using a stop block to make sure the tenon is at its right length. I milled some small thin pieces for the back panel. I miscalculated the measurement though, so I'm adding some small strips to make up the difference. These simply get glued together and once the glue dries, it's sanded flat. There's one more piece needed to close off this box, and for that I'm going to resaw some plywood to make it thin and flexible. I know there's a material called bendy plywood that's made exactly for this purpose, but I don't have any of that available in my area. I did have this walnut piece of plywood that I've been holding on for quite some time, like the top and bottom pieces of this project, so I figured this was a great time to use it. This piece would work perfectly as is, but I want to add some decorative details to it, and for that I'm using the render optic. This is a compact and portable laser cutter that has some very cool features. You start by unrolling the cutting mat and then rotating the arm to the operating position. The optic is the only laser cutter available with a built-in HEPA and carbon air filter, which means you don't have to vent it out a window or have a separate fume extractor. This is the filter. If you do want to go those other routes though, Render does offer an exhaust kit. Simply pull out the filter and replace it with the exhaust unit and attach a hose. This particular exhaust kit is a prototype version, but the production version will be available soon. This piece of plywood has a slight bow to it, so I'm taping it down to keep it flat. Next, the laser module needs to be adjusted to the correct distance away from the workpiece. Render made this very easy by including this gauge to set the height and an easily accessible lever next to the laser module. This orange shield is a very important safety feature and needs to be placed in order for the laser to operate. They also provide these certified laser safety glasses that need to be worn during operation. I've never used a laser before, and I'm happy to see how easy this is. I plugged in my computer to the USB-C port in the laser, opened Lightburn, loaded my design, and hit start. This is the laser running in real time. One of the coolest features that this laser cutter has is its nearly infinite workspace. While using the cutting mat, you can cut or engrave up to 12 by 18 inches, but the mat is easily removable and you can tile your art to cut or engrave as large as you'd like. I cut this piece to the right size using a handsaw, and I could have done this with the laser, but I didn't know the exact size that it needed to be. I held this piece up against the rest of the box pieces to get the right measurements, and made some small adjustments as needed to get the right fit. I want to add my logo to the bottom panel of this box, but the bottom piece doesn't fit under the laser. Thankfully, Render thought of this and offers an expansion kit which raises the entire unit. You simply pull off the laser from the cutting mat, it's held on with some very strong magnets, and attach these risers. This long one goes under the right side so the wheel under the arm has something to ride on. These risers are a prototype version, and the production version will include 1/2 inch, 1, 2, and 3 inch risers that can be combined to increase the clearance anywhere from 1/2 inch to 6.5 inches in as small as 1/2 inch increments. It's a very cool add-on that really increases the amount of things you could do with this laser. If you're interested, be sure to check out that link in the description, and thank you Render for sponsoring this video. The very last piece I need to complete this box is a handle for the door. I cut it on the bandsaw, and after a bit of shaping with some sandpaper, I glued it in place. Before putting the box together, it's easier to apply the finish to all the parts while the box is disassembled. And for the finish, I'm using a few coats of wipe-on poly. After the finish dried, I added some glue into the dados, but just in the center so that the side pieces have room to expand and contract with the seasons. I also added some glue in the track where the laser engraved piece will sit. Usually in a tambour box or a cabinet, there would be a notch cut into the track on the back side. This allows the door to slide in after the box is assembled, and also allows it to be easily removed if it needs any type of service in the future. I opted not to do that, and I figured if that situation ever comes up where I need to remove the door, I can always cut a notch then. This made assembling the box far more difficult. Throughout this build, I was really unsure with a lot of the design choices I made. There's a large open knot on top which leaves the joinery exposed. There's very unique grain on the door and a laser engraved piece on the side. I thought they might be competing for attention, but despite all of those different elements, I think they work together very nicely.